Hello. Welcome to the latest Trimarc Webcast. What's today? Thursday? Thursday, right? Is that what today is?
Thursday, all day.
I have been under the illusion, like I've been fast forwarding my week in my head and then rewinding it. On Tuesday, I swore up and down it was Thursday. That is the kind of week that I am having. And I'm not even the one that had to make the slides for this presentation. It's been an entire thing. Welcome to the broadcast, everybody. I see lots of people are joining. That makes me so happy, which means that I think what we have to talk about, you're really going to be interested in. My name is Danny Akoski. I am a business operations strategist here at Trimarc Security. Joining me is Brandon Colley, one of our security consultants for our Active Directory security assessment, just one of many assessments that we do here. We do assessments for Active Directory. We do one for VMware. We do one for Azure AD. You'll have to hold a gun to my head to get me to call it Entra yet, but I'm sure that that's coming. As long as Microsoft still calls it Azure, I'm going to do the same thing. Listen, we do a lot of these. We love doing webcasts. We love writing blogs. So while you're listening to this, love that title, Danny. Thank you, Jake. Head over to, or just remember it, I'll put it in the chat too, hub.trimarcsecurity.com. We have tons of blogs up there, tons of research, and we also have tooling to give out too. So if you go to github.com/Trimarc, you'll get things like Jake's locksmith tool, which is a tool for ADCS. You'll get our invoke active directory checks script, written, I think that's Sean Metcalf, our founder, wrote that. That is all for free. So if there's two main sites I want you to remember, github.com/Trimarc and hub.trimarcsecurity.com, because it's where all of our free stuff is. You don't have to register or anything. But all that being said, we have so much to get to today. I'm going to try to cut my blathering down in the middle of it as best as I can. And right today we have Findins and Fixins. My title, Brandon had to come around to it, but I think I like it. Remediating Trimarc's top 5 findings from our Active Directory Security Assessment Report. So these are things that when we have when we run these reports that we see pretty much across the board. Like they're frequent, we see them all the time. So we ranked them, people do top 5, top 20, top 10. These are our top 5. But what makes this different, and I'm going to let Brandon talk in like 30 seconds, is that now we're going to tell you about what's wrong and actually how to fix it, because remediation is weird. Remediation takes strategy and no small amount of luck for things to go right, and it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. That's why we did this. So hang out with us for the hour. You do have the ability to ask questions. I will see them and I will port them over to Brandon. So we encourage you to ask questions. Brandon has his stuff. Ask your questions. I will ask Brandon. Whatever we do not get to, I promise we will answer after the webinar is over. So without further ado, Brandon, take it away.
Thank you, Danny. Thanks for the wonderful introduction. You already handled my agenda slide, sir. So yeah, as Danny said, we are covering the Trimarc top 5. So these are the findings and the trends that we see every day in our Active Directory security assessments. These are all considered high priority findings, and I picked ones that had a little bit more of a challenging remediation, and so we'll go through that here in a second too. But so the way we're going to tackle these is we're going to just say what they are, what the finding is, explain a little bit about some of the terminology that may be unfamiliar to some people. We're going to then talk about why it's considered a finding, and then we're going to find them and we're going to fix them. So when I was setting this up, I decided that we were just going to look at the top 5 things. And so I was trying to pick out my 5 things. And the ADSA has almost 200 different checks in it. And so picking 5 out of 200 was not a small task. And I don't say that just to be sales pitchy or whatever. It's just trying to set a baseline for really how much is out there. And so some of the things that I could have talked about, but I'm not going to outside of this slide, is something like the built-in domain administrator account that has an old password that hasn't changed in 3 years, 5 years, ever, right? So I could go through that, but my remediation for that is just change the darn password. So that's not a whole lot of fun to really discuss. So we're done with that one, right? So speaking of passwords, another one that we see way too often is the 8-character minimum password length in the default domain policy. So with this one, this has been Microsoft's recommendation for, I don't know, the last 15 years or so. It hasn't changed. Everybody has it set. The default out of the box, you've set no password policy whatsoever is 7. So this is slightly better. So customers will say, well, how many more characters do we need? And so my quick answer to that one is simply just more. We just need more characters in the password policy, please. So that's just to say, those aren't the ones that I picked. I picked some of the more challenging ones, some of the more fun to talk on, a little bit more context in them. And so I want to talk just briefly about, so penetration tests, red teams, Volt scans, oh my, assessments in general. And this is really including Trimarc assessments as well. They typically come with a list of findings. They identify attack paths. In the case of a pen test, we'll pick on them a little bit. We'll say, this is how I got domain admin, right? This is how I, stole your finance reports, right? And sometimes they're full of scare tactics. Now, I don't say this to poo-poo on these assessments, and certainly that's not the goal whatsoever. But the thing that it's lacking is the remediation piece. And so Trimarc certainly strives to do a better job. And we've talked to a lot of other firms that we work closely with, and they're also trying to do a much better job about giving our customers a better idea about how to remediate. So how do you remediate, right? Danny said it's one of the hardest things to truly do. And so a consultant's favorite 2 words about how to remediate is, well, it depends. And so
it's not vague at all. It depends.
Which is true. It truly does depend, right? It depends.
That's the maddening thing. It's like, we're not just being like, how you usually go get your car worked on or whatever, and it's how much it's going to cost. It depends on if I got the O-ring in stock or whatever. No, this is legitimately like, this really does depend. Stick with us here.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it depends, and I'm going to kind of flip this around just a little bit, because ultimately it really does depend on the assessors or the company's knowledge of the vulnerability, how it exists, what it is, and also the client's ability to understand that vulnerability. The client's going to understand a little bit better about their business goals, but it's also the job of the assessment company to have an understanding of those business goals so we can find out where they meet. And that's important because there's options. And so that's really what I'm wanting to go through today, is this is going to be that buzzworthy, top 5 overplayed stuff. But I guess, hey, it got, 45 of you in the door, so it wasn't too terrible. But instead of just walking through these findings, and my goal is to show everybody something in one of these findings, whether you look at it and say, oh yeah, we already did that. Yeah, we implemented that 5 years ago. I'm hoping that I can bring some new options to it, because while you might have remediated it, things might have changed. While you might have accepted a certain level of risk, there may be new options available, or options that just someone hadn't thought of at the time. So that's the goal. And so without further ado, I guess I'll say, our first finding is going to be the improper account here. I'm going to take a quick drink, sorry.
Hydration's important, especially during remediation.
Especially, I've had like that dry throat. I don't know if it's the weather or what. So, but anyway, so what is this, right? What's improper account tiering? So basically, just at a very high level, it's just the designation or the identification of accounts that have administrative privileges, and then it's separating those accounts from regular accounts. So here I've got tier 0 assets being separated from regular user accounts. And before anyone kind of raises their hand and says, you know what, Microsoft does not talk about the tier model anymore. Microsoft's replaced the tier model. To that I say, yes, you're correct. So this is what the tier model looked like, or looks like, and this is what they replaced it with. So
that doesn't make it harder at all.
And again, I'm not trying to lessen anything, because I do understand this this new approach, this control plane approach that Microsoft has is important. But we only have an hour, so I'm going to talk about account tiering, and maybe next webcast we'll hire somebody else to talk about this data workflow plane.
Scott.
Yeah.
We'll make Scott do it.
I think we should. So that's what it basically is. That's what we're going to talk about. And so why is it really a problem? And some of this goes without saying, but I'm just going to touch on a couple little words that might make it make sense. So opportunity. So account tiering or problems with your account tiering, it creates opportunity for regular users to be more susceptible to things like phishing, to targeted attacks where maybe a threat actor is attempting to push malware to a specific workstation, something like that. If that account's not an administrative account, or if that account's not a local admin, then the opportunity isn't really isn't there, or it's not as great for sure. The other thing is the accountability of it, and what this kind of also makes sense as far as just not making mistakes by accidentally clicking on that phishing link and, oh, I didn't realize because it was highlighted that it would actually take me, and EDR popped up and it was crazy. We get to explain all that. No, it's more of that mental shift as an administrator. And I can say this because I was an administrator, and I can say this because I implemented account tiering. I took my own medicine, right? Like I made it for myself. And it really does kind of flip a switch in your head. As soon as you put on that admin hat, you realize that you now have more responsibility in your current role and what you're doing, and it's makes it a lot harder to make mistakes, those kind of stupid mistakes. Now, trust me, I made plenty of mistakes, right? So what this really does is it kind of prevents or makes it a lot harder for those unintended consequences that may lead to that lateral movement and privilege escalation. And we'll talk about that in a couple slides a little bit more. But on this slide, I also wanted to mention the first step in finding some of these accounts. And so this is an oversimplified screenshot that I took in my environment, my test lab, of just the administrators group. So this is the members that are in the administrators group. By default, that includes the domain admins, enterprise admins, and the built-in administrator account. So if you run that first command, that's what you're going to see. If you run it with the recurse flag, you're going to actually see just the user accounts. And what that's going to do is it's going to really tackle group nesting, which can be a huge problem when we're attempting to identify where our high priority assets are. A lot of times some users can hide in those nested groups. So in this example, it was just nested in the domain admins group, and it's obviously an administrative user. But this is an example that I wanted to throw out here. And so where do we start? So the first step at starting is basically implementing a something is better than nothing idea. And so this something is definitely the starting point. So these groups, the administrators, domain admins, enterprise admins, as I had mentioned in the previous slide, also added schema admins to this one. Those are kind of the top tier. They're the zeroest of the tier zero, I guess you can say. Also included are computers. So when we talk about tiering, the tiering model doesn't just affect user accounts, it's also computer accounts. So domain controllers specifically, and then this kind of starts getting into some of the hard part. This is where we start seeing some of our customers fail, is anything that controls those DCs. And so what do I mean by what controls a DC, right? So it can be the platform that it's installed on. So it's virtualized, it's in vCenter, for example. Your vCenter admins have access to see the console of a domain controller. They have access to that domain controller. Your storage administrators sometimes may also be VMware administrators too. Those guys are into those virtual disks, right? So they can see the VMDK files of those domain controllers. They could copy them, they could take them offline. Guess what? That includes Active Directory, right? That's on disk. So it's not just things that have access directly to the DCs, it's applications that are installed on them, or there's applications that are installed so tightly integrated with Active Directory that this access kind of prevails into those. And those are things like Azure Active Directory Connect, Exchange, PKI infrastructure with ADCS, as Danny had mentioned earlier, with Jake's tool Locksmith helps out with some of those remediations. And then things like an agent that's installed on the domain controller. Way too often we see things like SCCM that are used to patch all workstations, all servers, also patch your domain controllers. So it doesn't have to be SCCM. It's basically anything with an agent installed that can run code. Essentially has control over that domain controller. Okay, so once you've nailed that, you're ready for some of the hard parts, right? So here's the rest of it. This is as SpectreOps has collected things for the last, I don't know exactly how long they've been collecting these for, but I know Trimarc's collaborated on this list with SpectreOps. It's an open collab tool where it not only lists everything that's considered a tier 0 asset, it also talks about why and where they are and kind of the caveats and stuff like that. So it's a really good resource if you're looking to kind of level up in this space. And you'll notice that this doesn't only include those computer accounts and user accounts. It's containers. So you see the users container there at the bottom. It's group policies, the GPO linked to sensitive containers. So it's things like that that don't come top of mind. Those are the ones that aren't as easy to locate. Speaking of easy to locate, so I'm gonna jump into the cloud realm for just a second too, because this matters when we're looking at Azure Active Directory roles as well. And so what we find in the cloud is similar tiering problems. We're making the same mistakes that we made on-prem and we're making them in the cloud. And so I see this constantly where a global administrator's role looks good. It's only admins. It's very locked down. But as soon as we start progressing through the other, I don't know, hundreds of roles that exist, you're going to find non-admin users that are in those roles. And what's even funnier than that, or worse than that, I guess you could say, is sometimes it's administrative accounts, their regular account equivalent that is still left over from a pre-tier implementation. And so I've seen user accounts that have their regular account and their administrative account that still maintain the exact same role in Azure AD. That's also true on-prem. Okay, just a couple more of this. And so I told you that I was going to mention the new tiering model, which is the privileged access strategy. Microsoft has a bunch of different words for it, like ramp and other things. But basically this was introduced to kind of solve the problem that tier 0 had, where its focus was primarily on groups and accounts. This solves more of that big picture where we're now talking about life cycles and workflows. You'll notice, sorry, you'll notice devices are in this list. So once we're looking at the user and privileged access, we've got devices, interfaces, critical assets. We've got these all over the place as well. And so it's important to consider that when we're looking at that plane of existence. And right here, we have a bunch of the red warning signs. And those are basically your options for privilege escalation. And so what this is really trying to point out is that an account in a user access tier should not access a privileged application. Account should not be logging into a privileged workstation, for example, or they shouldn't share the same identity systems, right? And so that's what basically it's saying here is it's preventing the lower tier from accessing the higher tier. But what we do even a worse job with is the vice versa approach, right? So it's those privileged access workstations that exist for domain admins only to log into these workstations, yet help desk calls, they remote desktop into a regular user's workstation, and now all of a sudden credentials are stored in a user access plane instead. And so things like this that break in that vice versa way, those are the things that introduce problems such as the NTL and relay attack, impersonation, token theft, and that's what that privileged access workstation or a PAW or a SAW, that's what they attempt to fix. There's another 3-letter application that everyone really likes to slap on top of this, and that's called the PAM. So privileged access management does not solve this problem. Okay, I love privileged access, and the stuff that they do with that is awesome, but throwing money at the problem is not necessarily fixing the problem. So I'm glad you enjoyed my PAM slide, Danny.
So comments in the chat from Jim, we don't talk about Microsoft ramp. I'm not familiar with it, but whenever Jim says something like that, I just assume we don't.
I don't know. The name is, I mean, they really hit the acronym on the head when they're like, it's like ramp up. I can imagine like the old school Microsoft guys like jumping on stage, right?
Ramp, ramp, ramp. Also, Kevin Rice in chat asked, will a recording be posted to hub.tri? Yes. Matter of fact, a recording will be posted both to hub.trimarcsecurity.com, where all of our content is, and a recording will also be up on our YouTube for replay at your heart's content. I usually get those up by the end of day, so look for those. Check it out tomorrow morning. I guarantee it'll be up in both places.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll get that out of the way right now. All right, cool. So we jumped to our second finding. Sorry, I kind of clicked through as we were chit-chatting a little bit. So our second finding is accounts with SPNs. So an SPN refers to a service principal name. And what this is, just as a very simple explanation, is it's a unique identifier for a service, and it's used and required for Kerberos authentication. So it's also important to point out everything that this section is talking about is a standard function of Active Directory. It's not necessarily a vulnerability. It's required to exist. It's just the way it can exist and some of those protections that come around it. And so to give you a little bit more context about SPNs, this is an example. So the format is service, which is where the SQL comes in, the host name, which is the SQL.BrandonRocks, and then the port number. It could also be a service name or an instance name at that point. But that's basically what it looks like. And why is it defined? How could something so adorable?
Look at the puppy dogs. Oh, this almost makes me not afraid of clipper roasting anymore.
Yeah,
I know it's still horrifying and it actually is awful, but like, look at all these are babies.
All right, I'll try to scare it. I'll try to scare you again then, because
I'm sure it's not gonna take long.
it's not. Woo. So Kerber roasting. So this is what I like to call yesterday's sexy attack that is still just absolutely wildly prevalent. So
yeah, it's like the Brad Pitt of Active Directory. Yesterday's absolute sexiest, but still wildly popular.
I guess that is. I can't really contradict that, can I?
No. Go ahead, try to argue with me. But
I can't think of anything better. Well, next slide. So Kerber roasting really just simplistically talking about like the vulnerability that exists in this is the fact that Kerberos tickets are encrypted using the user account's password hash. And so the second piece of that is that enumeration exists. So naturally in Active Directory, any user account can query attributes about the domain itself or about user accounts. And any account that has an SPN, accounts need to request information about those SPNs. And that includes this Kerberos ticket. So basically what I'm saying here is that any user account in your domain can request this encrypted password hash for any account that has an SPN. And so that's the super simple way. This 80 security blog that I linked in here, that's getting a little bit more complicated, or I guess I'll say a lot more complicated. It's also important to point out that some of this has been addressed in recent versions of the operating systems, but still wildly prevalent, like I said. I believe this post was made back in 2015, if that tells you anything. And so as far as an attacker goes, in this instance, it's the same thing that defenders should do. So the very first step an attacker is going to take is the same step a defender should be taking. And that's basically that enumeration. You want to see what accounts exist that have SPNs. And so real quick, I'm going to give a shout out to Daryl, coworker and friend of mine who runs the Trimarc Identity Security Village. This provides hands-on hacking for Active Directory, and we're at plenty of conferences all over the year where we have this. In fact, I believe it is at GurCon as we speak. So shout out to our friends at GurCon.
I'm about to drop a link in the chat of, it's not physically a GurCon, but maybe we made a cloud version and maybe you want to check it out. Right now it is by like requesting invite, but I am told at the end of today, it will be open for everybody to use, and I will drop that link in the chat.
And I'll dig back through that last screenshot here in a second too, when we kind of talk about the finding or locating and fixing these Kerberoastable accounts. But first I wanted to show you what it looks like. So from an attacker perspective, you can run this in-packet framework, this get user SPNs. All you have to do is specify any user account in the domain, just the username, password, and it's going to output all of the SPNs. So that's the top one that's listing all of the SPNs that exist in the domain. And then that bottom screenshot is listing that TGS, that encrypted password is now given to the attacker for all of these accounts that are listed. So the next step is to try to crack that hash and retrieve a clear text password. So the one way to do that is using this John the Ripper tool. So this is one of many different hash cracking methods. And so all you need is a copy of that password hash. You need to specify the format that it's in, which is that KRB5 TGS, and then you give it a word list. And so a word list can just be a list of common passwords. It could also be identified as like a rainbow table is what we're essentially doing in this example, where we're just comparing the hashed version of all of those common passwords with the hash that we found. And if those hashes match, then we know that the password is for the hash that we used. So in this case, it ran through, it checked, a couple thousand different hashes, and it found the very secure 2 to be the password for this account. And so how do we find these accounts? So very simply, you can just run this PowerShell command, which will search your environment for service principal names that are not equal to null, is basically what the any null stands for here. So if you want to be a little bit more robust in it, we had mentioned, Danny had mentioned that we have a free tool on our GitHub, invoke Trimarc AD checks. This is one of the checks that will go in here and it will actually pull the same information, but it'll cross-check it with the access that's granted and kind of do a little bit of correlation for you as well. That check also does at least one of the other 5 that's on the list today. So check that out if you have not already. So once we know what SPNs exist, we want to evaluate, we know the accounts that have the SPNs, but the first thing we're going to do is evaluate what SPNs exist. So that's that first column that I've highlighted here. That's the service principal names. In this case, it's all the same SQL account, but what you can do in your environment is identify what Jim likes to call dangling SPNs, or these are basically SPNs that no longer exist. These are services that have been removed from the environment. These are servers that do not exist in the environment. So if you come across anything like that, the account can have the SPN removed and therefore fixes this vulnerability, and it can likely be just disabled or deleted altogether. So the next step, you'll look at that other column that I've highlighted, which is the member of column. And so this is obviously not real world. It's not as far off from the real world as you might hope. But here you'll see that we've got basically 10 plus domain admins listed in here. We do find this. We find in several assessments, we find at least one service account that has an SPN that is a domain administrator. We've even found the built-in domain administrator account has SPNs on it and therefore is easily attackable in this method. So that's that third step. And of course, it's not just group membership. So you're going to want to find also any delegated permissions. And so this is a little bit foreshadowing for what we're going to talk about in the next finding. But if we'll get to there in a second. So what we're going to do is we're going to identify those accounts that need those permissions removed. We need to see if we can dial back that domain administrative access. And I realize that sometimes vendors will state that they require this of service accounts. So this step might be a little bit harder. So we'll come back to this here in a second, and we'll go to step 4, which is identifying old passwords. So this is important for a couple different reasons. So first of all, I would modify that previous PowerShell to make sure that we're pulling the password last set field. And this will give us an idea of how old those passwords are. And really what we're talking about when we're looking at these accounts, we're talking about service accounts, because I mean, if they have an SPN, they're required for some sort of service. So a lot of times these are synonymous. And the other thing that service accounts are synonymous for is having really old passwords. So we see this again, time and time again, 3 years old, 10 years old, 15 years old. And I don't blame them. Obviously, coming from operations, telling someone to change the service account password is scary because you have no idea where it is. I don't know what server it's running on. I don't know how it's running. I don't know where the password is. I don't know it. I don't know where it's cached. I don't know where to change it, right? So when you change it in Active Directory, it's going to break something. What's it going to break? I don't know. And so what I'm here to say is that it's worth going on that treasure hunt, and this is why. So accounts that have old passwords are dangerous for 2 reasons in particularly. First is if you've got a 10-year-old password, that basically means that if an attacker had obtained that hash, they've had the last 10 years to attempt to crack it, which basically means that everything that's in the purple and the red in here, those passwords are now cracked. The other reason, and this is the one I'd like to point out specifically, is I like to tell people, so the password's 10 years old. What kind of passwords were you setting 10 years ago? Danny, what kind of passwords did you set 10 years ago? Were they good? What kind of password policy was there, right?
Mine probably they either had to do with Breaking Bad or Beyonce. And Beyonce, I will have you know, how many enterprises has Beyonce saved just because her name is a little more than 8 characters?
Yeah, that brings her further down in the list, I guess, right?
Think about all the breaches that happened for fans of Pink, right? Like Beyonce, way more secure than Pink.
All right.
Statistically.
That's going to be our new tagline. So yes, it's worth
campaigns now.
It's worth the treasure hunt, is what I'm saying. And so I also am going to take the opportunity to tear this graphic apart because I don't like this graphic. I never really have. And here's kind of why. Because it starts off on the left, identifying passwords that contain only numbers. And passwords that contain only numbers are actually known as pins. And those are usually like 4 to 8 characters. Nobody sets an 18-character numeric password. Okay, so we're going to get rid of that column.
There's actually a term for people who use 18-character numbers only. Those are called sociopathic passwords.
So I can't remember my password as it is, right? I can imagine just being numeric. So the other thing I want to really have a beef with here is the diversification of the far right. And the reason for that is that complexity, as it exists in Active Directory, states that it must have a number, an uppercase, lowercase, and a symbol, which is what that says. But complexity states that you only need 3 of those. So you can't enforce all 4. So it's not really an enforceable password. Now I get that if you set a password with that, okay, sure, you're more secure, and that's fantastic. But you can't enforce it as an administrative, as a decision maker, right? So we're going to knock those out. The other ones that I want to knock out is I want to talk about Active Directory because we have a very special birthday. Active Directory is 23 years old.
Yay!
So we can basically
and it's kept the same name. Microsoft Active Directory rebranded. That I
Wow.
know of. I don't know if point of order. I don't know if Active Directory was actually called something sooner besides
soon.
Active Directory.
So yeah, the moral of the story, what I'm trying to get at, and I realized that was kind of funny, but document. So go on that treasure hunt, find the passwords, the service accounts that use the crummy passwords, right? Because once you find them and you document them, you can change those to, I don't care, 18 character, 35 character. You're not something that you can't break in 20 trillion years, right? So let's get something secure on it. And then you've also got it documented. So guess what? You can go ahead and you can change it again, like when an admin leaves or something, like then it's not nearly as hard moving forward. So get those service accounts under wraps.
Well, if you're really old, Active Directory was born the same year as the movies Final Destination, X-Men, and 102 Dalmatians. Go ahead and contemplate that as you're going into your weekend when your bones hurt.
Oh, goodness sakes. Okay, so before I move on, I want to go back to these elevated permissions we talked about. All right, so you've got a service account. That service account logs into one workstation. Maybe not a huge deal. Maybe it's a local admin on that workstation. All right, one service account logs into 3 servers. Maybe it caches the credentials on those 3 servers, right? So those 3 servers kind of become in scope. Could be dangerous. But this is what it looks like when you have a service account that also acts as your backup account, and it needs to have access on all of your endpoints, right? So this is truly an elevated service account. This password needs to change. This account needs to be protected. And so while this account might be a domain admin, right? But it might just have like a group policy that gives it local admin on all these endpoints. And so that's what we call a transition. And that transition is, you like that?
Very smooth.
All right, excessive permissions. So excessive permissions is what we're talking about. And this is an example of an excessive permission set. These are some of the dangerous permissions that exist. This is not all of them by any means. I just grabbed a couple. And some of these are obvious, right? Forced password change sounds bad. But all extended rights, like what's that really? Generic all, that seems bad. Right DACL, that's going to let you change all of these permissions, right? But what about like these DS replication ones? So those first 2 that say DS replication, those come from a DC sync attack. So those are the permissions required to essentially force a domain controller to synchronize all of its assets to a location, and an attacker can exfiltrate all of the Active Directory data. Kind of a big deal. Those last 3, those are the brother or the sister to the DC sync, which is called the DC shadow. Similarly, you can stand up a rogue domain controller, one that's in the control of an attacker, and you can force it to replicate data to and from Active Directory. So it's also not so good. Easy way to exploit things. So it's not just those. So those permission sets, and usually when I say excessive permissions, my mind and certainly a lot of people's minds are going to go straight to OUs, right? Okay, these permissions are granted directly to an OU, a group, have access to a change membership of a group. I can change a password on a user for everybody in this OU. Well, writing something like generic all or right DACL on a GPO, for example, that might be linked to the domain controller's OU, that could be a big deal as well. And speaking of domain controllers, ownership of a domain controller, this is the computer object in Active Directory. And so by default, when a computer object gets created in Active Directory, whoever created it is the owner. And so what we continue to see is that it never gets cleaned up. So you've got these old administrator accounts, possibly they're regular accounts, before tiering happened, you added a domain controller. Or worse yet is you have a provisioning account that creates all of your workstations in the domain, including your domain controllers. That guy's the ownership on them. So go through and clean that up. And the places specifically to look at with this are obviously just the root of the domain controllers, and then any of those tier 1 assets that we talked about, any objects that are in OUs that are potentially sensitive.
I've had the phrase is potentially sensitive put on performance reviews for years.
So why is it a finding, Danny? Where are the excessive permissions, Danny?
Who has them?
Who has excessive permissions? And why on earth do they have the excessive permissions, right? That's the struggle. And thank you for this slide, Danny. This was good.
It's my paltry contribution to the cause.
Yeah. Enjoy that pumpkin latte. So
this is no, listen, I will not be disparaged live on air. This is a regular iced coffee. There's no pumpkin in it. How dare you?
I'm sorry. So follows upon us. So excessive permissions, like why are they there? Sometimes they make sense. So I want to go out and say that first and foremost, right? It could be the lesser of two evils. And what I always think about with this is the account that's used for Azure Active Directory Connect, where it synchronizes your on-prem to the cloud. That account could be in domain admin, or it could be granted only the permission it needs on only those OUs that it needs. So really, you have to look at each of the permissions that exist and identify and kind of ask yourself some of these questions. And also think about what can an attacker do? So what attack paths exist with this? So we see accounts all the time that are presumably help desk administrators that have the ability to change passwords. Well, they could change passwords on sensitive accounts, on those service accounts we just talked about. They could modify group membership, so they could add themselves to groups. What about accounts that have access to change group policies? That could be a big deal. And then the ownership, like we talked about earlier too. That can play a role in it. So how do we find these? So if you want to really just dig into a tool, this CyberArk ACL Lite tool, that's a good option. I don't have one on the Trimarc GitHub yet. Maybe that's a good future addition. But honestly, I threw this screenshot in here because this is just the advanced security properties of the root of the domain in my lab. In the very first one, you can already see that there's a problem where I've granted a regular user account the ability to reset passwords for everybody in the domain. So there is a little bit of things to sift through in here. That's some of the default stuff that's not to be concerned with. But sometimes just looking is all that you really need to do. And fixing it's almost that easy too, because honestly, just remove it. So if you find a permission that seems like it shouldn't be there, let's get rid of it, document it, get rid of it. And if you can't get rid of it, then let's protect it. And by protect it, I mean, let's protect the account that is granted that elevated permissions. So that account now becomes a tier 0 account. So protect it like you protect your other tier 0 assets. And also restrict it, right? I talked about that cloud sync account. Don't let it have that access to an account with all of your administrators for your on-prem that you're not synchronizing to the cloud anyway. It doesn't need it. So restrict that access from getting into locations that it doesn't need to be. Same sort of thing with like help desk resets, stuff like that. Just restrict it, don't grant it at the root, grant it further down where it makes sense. And when I made this slide, it reminded me of Pop It, talk about feeling old. Danny, right? Back when this thing came out was maybe predated, I should have looked this up, predated Active Directory or not. But remember like the remove it, protect it, restrict it, Pop It.
Bop It was a fidget spinner before fidget spinners were cool.
That was my joke. Thanks for saying.
Yeah, well, you're the one presenting all the cool slides. I don't do cool research. I don't write this stuff. Give me something.
All right, that's your joke, you're right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bop It came out in 1996. Bop It predates Active Directory.
Wow, okay.
It's a piece of trivia none of you will ever need to know, but just in case anybody does ask you, what came first, Bop It or AD? Bop It.
If that ever comes up in casual conversation, somebody ping me on Twitter. Like I'll send you a T-shirt or something like that.
If you find a way to work it in, definitely send a message to myself or Brandon, or just message the Trimarc Twitter, and we'll send you something. If you find a smooth way to work it into a conversation.
Yeah.
Well, actually.
Well, actually, Boppet predates Active Directory. You know about Kerberos delegation, guys? Boppet came before Kerberos delegation. But what is Kerberos delegation, you may ask, Danny? I'm glad you asked. Because Kerberos delegation was created to kind of solve this double hop problem that exists. So Microsoft introduced this as a simple idea to handle this scenario where a user workstation or a user account authenticates to a web front end, for example, and then that web front end needs to retrieve data from a database based on that user's information or based on that user's access. Well, the user didn't authenticate to the database, right? So how does the database know? Well, that web server has been delegated that access to act on behalf of the user that logged into it. And so Kerberos delegation, it comes in multiple different flavors. So unconstrained came first, and then constrained, which obviously sounds better. And then these confusing guys came along too with protocol transition and what's known as RBCD. So why is this a finding? It's required. I mean, I just explained why it's required, and it makes total sense, right? And the easiest way that I've always been told about how this is a finding is that basically delegation means impersonation. So if they were to call it Kerberos impersonation instead, it's a little bit scarier. I know you've kind of thinking about the imposter, right? Like it's basically you can act on behalf of someone else. And so what that attack path really looks like is that an attacker compromises a server that's leveraging unconstrained delegation. So it could be that web front end. Maybe it's open to the internet, so maybe it's really easy to get access to. And then all you have to do is convince a domain admin, so social engineer someone to log into that application. It doesn't have to be domain admin. It can be elevated credentials. Who knows, right? So once they log into that machine, that authentication sits in memory. And so that ticket can be stolen and then used to impersonate that administrative account elsewhere in the environment. And so constrained was introduced to help solve this problem, but it's also exploitable. And so that's going to get a little bit more complicated. And so I've added these two links here, which are fantastic ways to explain a little bit more about the problem. Okay, so how do we find these in our environment? Accounts that are used for some sort of delegation. And so we've got a couple different types, as I mentioned. So because of that, we have a few different mechanisms to find these. And so this is what you can do in PowerShell. You can run filters and locate your computers and users that have these attributes set. That last one is a little bit trickier. You kind of have to do a little bit of this magical changes to pull out that wildly long name attribute. But you can find these things pretty easily just using PowerShell. And don't freak out when you run this and you find domain controllers. That's expected. As I had mentioned before, this is very intended behavior and is really kind of integral to how Active Directory works. So that's what makes it really hard to fix. And that's why we see this everywhere. Almost everywhere have constrained delegation or unconstrained delegation as just a requirement to run business. So if it's a requirement to run business, how do you handle this? Well, you kind of just lessen that footprint, right? So anything you could remove, if it doesn't have an SPN associated with it, that typically means that it can't delegate to anything. And so delegation is not really occurring. So in many times, if it doesn't have an associated SPN with that object, it can just be, the delegation can be removed. Again, maybe the account object can also be removed. Move it to constrained. I mentioned constrained is better. I mean, it just sounds better, right? Unconstrained just seems wild. It's like horses without a gate in the barn, right? At least you put the horses in a barn, they're constrained. So if you can't constrain it, or if you can, protect it too. That's kind of the next step, is protect that asset that has the delegation. I'd mentioned the very first step to exploiting this is an attacker getting access to that asset. So protect it. Speaking of protecting, you also want to protect your admins, because remember what I had said about impersonation and the delegation. If your administrator accounts have this account is sensitive and cannot be delegated flag configured on their user accounts, then they cannot be impersonated. So by protecting your administrative accounts, you're really making it harder. So if even impersonation could occur, this will prevent it from occurring and could potentially limit that footprint. The other thing you can do if you're ready to really level up is use the protected users security group. So this also performs protection against delegation attacks. It also does a lot of other awesome stuff, which is why I just linked it here. All right, and that's bringing us to our last one, which is the hard ones. And I promised people on Twitter that we had Star Trek.
Yay. Oh, and by the way, if you stick around until the end, I will just drop in the slides as PDFs for you, so you don't have to wait for them. I have them for you right here.
Awesome. Cool. All right, let's not keep people longer than they need to stay here then. Let's get them some slides. Okay, so what do I mean the hard ones? I mean literally the hard ones. These are the ones that are the most prevalent. These are the ones that everyone needs to fix. And that's disabling SMBv1, enforcing NTLM-v2, and enforcing LDAP channel binding and signing. I'm really starting to lose my voice, so I apologize for that. Okay, so SMBv1, and Danny, this version 1 thing, so that's the font. This font is weird. You see that? Okay, that says V1, not VI. I don't like
fonts are gonna font.
Fonts do their thing. So anyway, what is it? It's a server message block, which is file sharing protocol. It is 30 years young, and it allows for an adversary in the middle style attack, sometimes called an on-path attack. And actually all 3 of these really are aiming at that attacker in the middle, and I'll continue to talk about that as we move on. So the finding, the fixing, it all exists in these commands. So you can identify if this is a problem in your environment by just looking to see if SMBv1 is enabled. Then you can audit for it. So that second command is going to allow these event IDs with the 3000 to appear in your event ID. So you can identify if any SMBv1 is actually occurring. And then obviously you can turn it off. So it is important to note that by default, Windows 11 and 2019 server do have this disabled, but you can enable it. And if you did an in-place upgrade, it may not have turned it off. So just because you say that you're running all server 2019 doesn't mean that this is not necessarily a problem in the environment. And so really the best way to fix it ultimately is this GPO. So you can use a group policy to set this registry, and you can set it everywhere in the environment to restrict SMB from being used. And this link down here, that link also includes all of the commands and a ton of awesome information about how to get rid of it, SMB. So NTLM, on to number 2 of the hard ones. I told you this was more than 5. So NTLM is an authentication protocol that uses the challenge response, and it replaced, quote, replaced Kerberos as many as 20 years ago. And part of the vulnerability with this is it stores hashes as unsalted, which basically means that it's more susceptible to password cracking. But what I think is probably even more scary is just the idea of these 2 attack strategies, which are pass the hash and NTLM relay attacks. And I'd love to show this to you, but instead I'm just going to try to explain it really quickly. So CrackMap exec is basically the Swiss Army knife of hacking tools. And what this command's attempting to do, the first one is connecting to an SMB share on that IP address and authenticating with the administrator username and password. What passing the hash allows is for you not to even have to know the password. If you're able to perform that adversary in the middle attack, get the hash, then you can just pass the hash, and there you have authenticated as if you knew what the password was to begin with. And so fixing this can be a long road. So remediation can take a really long time. So how do we do this, right? Depending on where you are, as far as what's currently set in your environment and what limitations you might have, ultimately the goal is to get all the way to the bottom of this list where you're forcing NTLM v2 to occur. If you're not there yet and you're worried that doing that's going to break something, I would say let's go to step 2 first, enable some auditing, and then you can go back to step 1 and enforce NTLM v2. So the goal as of right now, I would say, is get to v2 and then start thinking about completely getting rid of NTLM in general. So enforcing Kerberos wherever possible. And over the last couple of years, Microsoft has really done a good job of adding a lot of these options. So all of these options are for restricting in very specific ways. So you can only impact incoming NTLM. So you can apply this only on domain controllers for incoming or whatever you want to do, right? Then you can also modify how the auditing is occurring. You can get the kind of information you want to know what's happening in your environment. And then once you've really narrowed things down and you're ready to turn stuff off, you can set exceptions. So once you know what's going to break, you can add those to the exception list, those first 2 that are listed there, and you can really begin to lock down NTLM. Now I realize that this is hard, really verging on impossible in most environments, but as I mentioned before, it's worth trying. The last one that's also worth trying, also very hard, LDAP signing and channel binding. So LDAP stands for Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, and it's essentially synonymous with Active Directory. It's kind of like Active Directory under the covers. When you're talking about protocols, they can kind of go hand in hand. It might mean something different in your environment if you actually have different LDAP servers running, but that's basically what it means. Is it's the communication between a application and Active Directory, and it's vulnerable also because of this adversary in the middle style of attack. And so setting this comes also in those security options in group policy. The client needs to be set to require signing. Domain controller has these 2 settings. The LDAP server signing requirements up top also needs to be require signing. And then the channel binding at the bottom should be set to always. And so I didn't really have time to research a ton about auditing this specific control beforehand, but what I do know is that setting this channel binding to when supported essentially sets that kind of audit configuration. So when supported doesn't protect you necessarily, but you will start getting failure logs so you can identify some of the things that will break when you change it to always. So even though I didn't have time to do it, my boss Scott had time to do it, or he's certainly going to have time to do it because he wrote a blog. This is the blog that was posted a couple of years ago. It is due to be redone in the next month or so. I believe we'll have an update to this that will be coming out with some new information on Scott's favorite vulnerability. And with that, let's conclude real quick. I'm just going to walk through kind of what we had talked about. And then if we have time, we can do some questions. So improper account tiering. This was basically your tier 0 assets preventing that lateral movement to occur. Starting with those easy tier 0s, computer accounts certainly matter in talking about this. Doing a full review of all of the roles, all of the groups in your environment that have high privileges, and then do it again. Continuously monitor for changes to those groups. Set it up as an annual audit. Accounts with SPNs, this is the Kerberoasting example with that cute little puppy dog, right? Let's find the vulnerable accounts. We'll find the accounts with SPNs. we remove what we can do, and then we restrict that access, and then we ultimately change passwords. Access permissions was our third one. These are the ACLs that are either on the root or the domain controller. These are on GPOs. So remove them, protect them, restrict them. Kerberos delegation. So this is the impersonation. This allows that web server to contact the database. And here we wanted to query for the attributes in Active Directory for accounts that have this configured. Remove the delegation from unnecessary accounts, those accounts that didn't have SPNs, and then we constrain it, protect the asset, and then we implement the protection of administrative accounts to prevent impersonation of those accounts. And then our hard ones, like we had said, I want to point out with this one that hard doesn't mean do it last. These are highly prevalent problems, but they're also prominent in almost every attack vector. SMB v1, NTLM, v2, LDAP sign and channel binding. It's definitely worth doing that. Configure the auditing where available and configure the exclusions. And that puts us pretty close to time. And so thank you all for watching. This is our link tree on the right, Danny. And then if you want to follow me on Twitter or ping me with any questions that you might have after the fact, I would love to answer anything if we have time now, or you can hit me online.
Scott Blake in the chat has a question. Question for the handsome fellow in the Trimarc shirt. Do you think these common issues remain common because they are difficult to resolve or a lack of knowledge / understanding?
That's a good question. So the hard ones are definitely still prevalent because they are hard to do. Some of the other ones are just built-in native to Active Directory. So part of the problem with a lot of these is they're not misconfigurations. They're default configurations. They're a cost of doing business. And some people will just mark that cost of doing business as a risk accepted, right? So I don't know that it's as much education, but to a certain degree, I hope that it is. I hope that stuff like this really kind of gets people the knowledge that they need to kind of go out and identify in their own environments if anything can be done, because ultimately it's not if an attacker is going to go after you, it's kind of when that attacker is going to. So thank you, Scott. That was a good question.
Not a question, but a comment. Oh, people really love what you've done with this one. Alexander Olander Rasta says, thank you as always for the awesome information. I can't believe this stuff is free. Free is important to us. The things that we give back, like that's why we do this. Like yes, it's a business and we make money and all that kind of thing, but when we can do it for free, like this is what we love to do. Scott said that was a good answer, Brandon. Damn good answer. Great presentation. Thank you from John Hardelin. I'm sorry for butchering your names, but
I know that guy.
Oh, okay. Well, Hartline it's E before I, or so is it? Would it be? You know what? I don't. Doesn't matter. It matters, but I'm not good at it. Anyway, thank you for all of the kind feedback. Cheers from Italy, Enrico. Thank you so much.
Nice.
For this. So yes, that is all of our links. I posted our link tree, so you can click on it right in the chat. I will have this up on our YouTube and up on the hub along with everything else, like I stated earlier, by end of day today, but just give me some wiggle room until tomorrow morning. All of our other ones, if you signed up for our email list, you're going to hear about our next webcast, which is in just a couple of weeks with Jake Hildreth. He created something where all of the things that I could know about your environment without ever seeing it, what he could extrapolate just from a scoping call or whatever. So that's going to be our next webcast in a couple of weeks. That invite will be sent out shortly, right after this one. Thank you from Canada. Great flow of the presentation, David Marble Hill. Heartline, my apologies, John. Thank you so much. And with that, for myself, Danny Akatsuki, and of course the star of the hour, Brandon Colley, thank you so much, and we'll see you in a couple weeks with our next webcast. and we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.